somewhere inside a university press volume that almost nobody bought, published in 2005, priced at $150, shelved in the back corners of academic libraries, and almost never reviewed by anyone outside a narrow circle of specialists, there is a finding that should have made headlines around the world. It did not make headlines. It did not make the evening news. It did not appear in the science sections of major newspapers or the feeds of medical journals that ordinary people actually read. It was documented carefully, footnoted precisely, and then left largely where it landed, in the kind of silence that falls over discoveries that do not fit the story we have already decided to tell about human history. What that finding says is that a civilization that collapsed more than 2,000 years ago, a civilization whose language no living person grew up speaking, whose cities are mounds of dust in modern Iraq, whose writing was pressed into wet clay with a reed and baked into tablets that survived only because fire destroyed the buildings around them, that civilization had a word for cancer, not a myth about it, not a prayer against it, a clinical term used by working physicians inside a medical system sophisticated enough that a trained doctor reading the translation in 2005 recognized what was being described without anyone having to explain it to him. But here is the part that has been kept even quieter than the diagnosis itself. The same tablets that describe the disease also describe the approach to it. They described what the physicians tried when they could still reach the growth. They described what plant compounds they applied to the body. They described the physical interventions the ancient surgeon attempted. They described what they believed could help the body fight back, and what signs told them the body could no longer be helped. There is knowledge in those tablets about recognizing this disease, about confronting it, about what the ancient world tried against it, that the official history of medicine has barely begun to examine. And the reason it has barely begun is not because the tablets are destroyed or missing. It is because the right two people had not yet sat down together to read them until 2005, when they finally did. Now, before we go any further, two things. The document linked below this video and the QR code you can see on your screen right now contains the full translated tablet passages, the complete clinical comparison between what the Babylonian physicians wrote and what modern oncology confirms, and the section of those ancient texts dealing specifically with the compounds and interventions the physicians applied when they believed the growth could still be addressed. That document goes into detail this video does not have time for. It is free. It is linked. Pull it up now before we continue. And second, subscribe. Turn on the notification bell, because what follows is the kind of material that only keeps reaching you if this channel keeps growing. So let us continue. In 2005, a professor of infectious diseases at the University of Illinois College of Medicine sat down with a woman who could read a dead language that had not been spoken in 4,000 years. The medical doctor's name was Burton Andersen. He had spent decades in clinical medicine, working inside hospital settings, studying how disease moves through the human body, how infection behaves differently from deterioration, how the body fails, and in what order, and what it looks like when something is consuming a patient from the inside at a rate that treatment is not slowing. He was a physician, not a historian, not an archaeologist, a physician who read disease the way physicians read it, by looking at the total clinical picture and recognizing the pattern. The woman who could read the dead language was JoAnn Scurlock, a scholar of Assyriology from the University of Chicago. Assyriology is not a large field. There are, at any given time, only a few hundred people in the world whose professional training is in reading and interpreting cuneiform, the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia. Cuneiform is not a single language. It was used to write both Sumerian and Akkadian, two entirely distinct languages, both of them completely extinct, neither of them spoken by anyone alive today. Scurlock had spent her career inside that material. She knew its vocabulary and its grammar, its conventions, the way different periods of writing used different signs for the same concept, and crucially, the specific vocabulary that ancient Mesopotamian physicians had developed over centuries to describe what they were seeing in sick patients. What Andersen and Scurlock produced together after years of working through material that had never been examined with this combination of linguistic and clinical expertise, was an 879-page volume published by the University of Illinois Press. Its title was the kind of title that guarantees a book will not escape its field. Diagnoses in Assyrian and Babylonian Medicine, Ancient Sources, Translations, and Modern Medical Analyses. $150. Reviewed in a handful of academic journals, noted by the small community of scholars whose work it touched, and otherwise left to sit in the quiet that falls over serious scholarship that the wider world is not paying attention to. Inside that quiet, inside those 879 pages, the finding waited. To understand what they found, you have to understand what they were reading. The medical literature of ancient Mesopotamia is not a thin record. Roughly 1,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments dealing specifically with medicine have been recovered from excavation sites across modern Iraq, covering a span from approximately 2,200 BCE through to the late periods of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. Of those, 660 medical tablets from the royal library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal are preserved in the British Museum in London. They have been there since the 19th century. They were excavated, catalogued, and placed in storage. Most of them waited in that storage, untranslated in any medically useful way, for most of the time between their discovery and the moment Scurlock and Andersen published their work. The problem was not that scholars were indifferent. The problem was the structure of the obstacle. Mesopotamian medical texts were written in Akkadian and Sumerian, both dead languages. The tablets were fragmentary, damaged, physically scattered across museum collections in London, Paris, Berlin, Philadelphia, and Baghdad. A single medical series meant to be read as a coherent whole had been divided between institutions on different continents by the accident of which expeditions sold or donated which tablets to which museum. And the clinical vocabulary these ancient physicians used, the specific terminology they developed over centuries to describe what the body does when it is sick, required more than a linguist to interpret. It required a physician sitting next to the linguist, hearing the translation as it came out, and saying whether the clinical picture it described was something recognizable. That combination had almost never been assembled before. It is precisely why the finding about cancer waited until 2005. The foundation of ancient Mesopotamian medicine was a text known in Sumerian as the Sakikku. The name translates roughly as symptoms. It was not a religious text. It was not a collection of incantations, though incantations existed in the medical tradition alongside it. The Sakikku was a diagnostic handbook, 40 clay tablets forming a single coherent clinical system. The handbook was compiled over centuries and reached its canonical form under a chief scholar named Esagil-kin-apli, who served the Babylonian king Adad-apla-iddina around 1067 BCE. But the observations it collected were older than the compilation, drawn from a continuous tradition of medical practice reaching back into the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The physicians who built the Sakikku were not working from theory. They were working from what they had seen. 40 tablets, organized from the head downward through the body, symptoms recorded for each region, prognoses assigned to each condition, treatments described, and running through those 40 tablets with a consistency that Scurlock and Andersen could not overlook, a category of disease that kept appearing across multiple tablets, in multiple sections of the body, described in clinical language that was different from the language used for anything else in the record. The Babylonian physician was not one practitioner, he was two, working inside a defined system. The Asu was the physician in the physical sense, the one who prepared remedies, worked with plant compounds, mineral ingredients, and animal-derived materials, applied treatments to the body, prescribed what the patient was to consume, and how, and in specific circumstances, performed direct physical interventions. The Ashipu was the diagnostician, the one who read the body's signs, observed the pattern of symptoms, determined what the illness was and what course it was likely to take, and gave a prognosis the Asu would use to decide what to do. Both practitioners left records in the tablets. Both contributed observations, and both, across the sections dealing with what the texts called conditions of abnormal flesh, left descriptions of the same category of illness. What Scurlock read out of the cuneiform and what Andersen heard as a physician listening to a clinical description was not the picture of an infection, not a wound, not a fever or a parasite or an inflammatory condition. What the tablets described was a process, flesh that thickens in a location where it should not thicken, and that continues to thicken without an identifiable cause and without responding to the treatments that successfully addressed every other category of illness in the record. Flesh that spreads, that moves outward from its point of origin to locations adjacent to where it began, and then, over time, to locations in the body that are not adjacent at all, associated with a progressive wasting of the patient's overall flesh, even as the growth itself expands, associated with loss of appetite, with profound and increasing weakness, with changes in the color of the skin, and eventually with the failure of organs at some distance from the site where the thickening first appeared. The Akkadian compound the Babylonian physicians used for this category of disease translates, after Scurlock's careful work on the terminology, into something in modern English that reads as the growth that consumes, or the flesh that grows without stopping. Any physician who has observed what an untreated malignancy does to a human body over time will read that phrase and not need a translation. The growth that consumes, the flesh that grows without stopping. That is not poetry. That is clinical observation, recorded in the only vocabulary available to a physician who did not have the word carcinoma, did not have the word tumor in a modern biological sense, did not have a laboratory or an imaging machine, but had eyes and hands and the accumulated weight of generations of watching what this particular kind of disease does to a person and recording what they saw. What the tablets describe next is the part that moves this from historical footnote into something that deserves genuine attention. The Babylonian physicians who describe this disease did not treat it the way they treated everything else. They made distinctions. They distinguished between growths accessible on the surface of the body and those that appeared to originate or settle in the interior. They distinguished between growths that remained localized and growths that had begun to spread. They described a progression, a staging, and they assigned different responses to different stages. For the accessible growth, the one the physician could see and reach, the tablets describe a physical intervention. The Asu did not only apply a compound to the surface of the growth, he cut. The tablets describe a deliberate, planned surgical attempt to remove the mass from the body. This was not an emergency procedure. It was a considered clinical decision made after assessment. The patient had been evaluated. The growth had been identified as the consuming kind. The physician had determined that the growth was reachable, and the physician removed it. That is surgical oncology, performed 4,000 years ago, recorded in cuneiform, sitting in an academic volume priced at $150. The compounds used alongside these interventions are also recorded in the therapeutic texts, the companion tablets to the diagnostic series. The Babylonian Materia Medica lists more than 150 plant-derived substances used medicinally. Some of those plants, when subsequent researchers with pharmacological training examined the identifications Scurlock made, turned out to contain biologically active compounds that modern science recognizes as relevant to inflammation, to the regulation of abnormal cell activity, and to tissue recovery after injury. The ancient physicians did not know the mechanisms. They knew the outcomes because they had watched them across enough patients and enough generations to understand what worked and what did not. For the internal consuming growth, the one beyond the reach of the surgeon's knife, the one that had already spread to organs at a distance from its origin, the tablets gave a different assessment. They stated it directly. In the same register, they used for every other difficult prognosis in the diagnostic series. The patient described in those terms was not expected to recover. The physicians who wrote that had not run out of remedies. They had run out of cases in which those remedies had worked, and they were honest enough to say so. 2,000 years of watching, and they knew the Egyptian connection does not stand apart from this. It sits beside it in the same historical moment. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, written around 1600 BCE, but believed by scholars to be a copy of material considerably older, possibly reaching to 2500 BCE, contains a direct description of a patient with hard tumors of the breast, spreading, firm to the touch, not responding to treatment. The Egyptian physician's recorded verdict for this condition was 4 words in translation. There is no treatment, not a different treatment, not a ritual, no treatment. An Egyptian physician assembling a medical manual looked at what advanced breast malignancy does to a patient and concluded that the most honest thing he could record for the physicians who would come after him was that this particular condition was beyond what medicine could stop. The Babylonian physicians arrived at the same conclusion for internal consuming growths in their advanced stages, and they recorded it in the same clinical tone. 2 civilizations working across the same historical era, building the same honest assessment of the same disease through the same method. Observation accumulated over time until the pattern became undeniable. That accumulated knowledge was then buried by the fall of the civilizations that held it. The cuneiform tablets went under the rubble of burned cities. The medical papyri survived only in the accident of Egypt's dry climate. The royal library of Ashurbanipal was physically shattered when Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The work of putting those fragments back together is still happening in museum offices and university departments and digitization projects working through material that has sat in wooden trays since the 1800s. What Scurlock and Andersen produced in 2005 is the most thorough attempt yet made to recover the medical content of what was buried. And what they recovered, when a physician and a linguist finally read it together, is the clinical record of physicians who knew what cancer was, named it in their own language, staged it with their own system, attempted to treat it with what they had, and recorded the outcome with an honesty that the history of medicine owes them a great deal more credit for than it has so far given. The tablets are real. The translations are real. The finding is real. And the physicians of ancient Babylon describe the consuming growth that does not stop more than 4,000 years before anyone alive today was born. Everything in that last section, the full tablet passages in translation, the plant compounds identified by Scurlock and their pharmacological profile, the complete clinical comparison between Babylonian staging and modern oncological staging, and the specific section of the therapeutic texts dealing with what the ancient physicians applied when the growth was still accessible. All of it is in the document linked below this video. The QR code is still on your screen. That document is the piece of this that does not fit inside a video. It is free, and it is there. And if you are still here at the end of this, tap subscribe, turn on the bell. The history that has been sitting in museum drawers and academic volumes is long, and there is a great deal more of it still to surface. Stay with us. One more thing before you go. The question people ask, the one that sits underneath all of this, when you step back and look at it honestly, is why it matters. Why does it matter that 4,000 years ago, a physician in Babylon named the same disease we are still fighting today? It matters because of what those physicians understood about observation that our own era keeps forgetting. They did not have instruments. They did not have theory in the modern sense. They had time, and they had the discipline to use it carefully. They built a medical record by sitting with patients for 2,000 years and writing down exactly what they saw, without flinching at what was difficult to record, without softening the prognosis when the prognosis was grim, and without discarding the observation because it did not fit the framework they had inherited from the generation before. They followed what was actually in front of them, and they wrote it down. That practice produced, in the matter of cancer, a clinical description that a physician working with the most sophisticated diagnostic tools available in 2005 could read and immediately recognize. 4,000 years of separation, 2 dead languages, a completely different civilization, a completely different world, a completely different understanding of what the body is and how it works. And the clinical picture that came through all of that distance was still accurate enough to be recognized on contact. That is what sustained, honest observation over long time can produce. And it is a lesson that the Babylonian physicians, pressing their reed styluses into wet clay in a city that is now a mound of dust in southern Iraq, left for us in the clearest language they had. We are only now in a position to read it properly. And what it says is that the consuming growth was known. It was watched. It was named. It was met, as squarely as the tools of the age allowed, by people who left us a record of what they saw and what they tried, so that those who came after them would not have to begin from nothing. The tablets survive. The knowledge in them is older than we knew. And the physicians who built that knowledge deserve to be remembered by name, not as footnotes in an academic volume priced out of most people's reach, but as the first chapter of a medical tradition that has been running, in one form or another, ever since.